Okay, it is 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. We're continuing our exhibit called Sales, Trails, Rails, and Wings. And today's speaker is Stephen Gonzales, and he's going to talk about the El Camino Real. Stephen, thank you very much for being here. We really appreciate it. And whenever you're ready, I'll go ahead and pass it off to you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Can y'all see my screen at this point with
Yes.
the presentation? Excellent.
Yep.
I am thinking that I'm going to try to stop my camera just so that we have enough bandwidth to make sure everything is slowing or moving, not slowing down here. So let me see if I can make this work. Give me just 1 second. Can y'all still see me?
Yes, we can still see this slide.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me today. My name is Stephen Gonzales, and I'm Executive Director of El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail Association. Our acronym is LCAT, and I'm very happy to be here with you today. I'm actually from the Coastal Bend, originally out of Corpus Christi. I was born and raised there, and still have a lot of family there. And we used to go into the Aransas Pass and Aransas County area all the time. I love the National Wildlife Refuge down there. And my grandparents even owned some land out there in Rockport. So, you know, it's always been, you know, close to home for me to spend time out there. And I'm glad to be here with you today. Today, my presentation is called El Camino Real de los Tejas, Past and Present. And what I'm going to do is go over 5 different themes today. First, I'm going to define what a Camino Real is. Then I'll go over a brief history of the trail. Then I'll talk about modern events leading up to the designation of the trail as a National Historic Trail. Then what it means to be a National Historic Trail and part of the National Trail System. And then finally, how you can see and experience the trail today. So with that said, let us begin. So we will start by defining a Camino Real. Caminos Reales are royal roads, and these emanated from, at least here in North America, they emanated from the viceregal capital of Mexico City, and they connected Spanish provincial capitals. And so they went from Mexico City to places like Querétaro to Zacatecas, Zacatecas to Monclova, and then over to Los Adayes, which was the first capital of Texas, which is in present-day Louisiana, and then secondarily San Antonio when it was the capital. Caminos Reales also connected mines and villas with royal charters. So villas such as San Antonio had royal charters that allowed them royal privileges. Here is a map of the Caminos Reales coming into the southwestern US. And as you can see, there are 3 trails that come into the US here. There's our trail, El Camino Real de los Tejas, which spans across Texas into Louisiana. There's our sister trail, El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, which crosses through El Paso before heading up to Santa Fe. And then there's the Camino Real de California, which spans the coast of California there all the way up to San Francisco. Only 2 of these trails are National Historic Trails, our trail and the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro in New Mexico. Though the Camino Real de California is probably the most famous of the Caminos Reales, and it connects all the missions there along the coast. So if you've ever been to Mission Santa Barbara or Santa Ynez or San Juan Capistrano, those are places along the Camino Real de California. And we are hopeful that one day it will be designated as a National Historic Trail, but at this point it hasn't been. So now I'd like to go over a brief history of the Camino Real. And what I'm going to talk about today will be Spanish entradas or expeditions that sought out La Salle and the French in the late 1600s, and then the early Anglo period of the trail in the early 1800s. So true intentional Texas history begins in 1685 when the Frenchman La Salle established Fort St. Louis on Garcitas Creek in Victoria County. The Spanish took this as an incursion into their territory, and so because of that, they began sending out entradas or expeditions in search of La Salle and his fort. These entradas were done both by land and by sea. So expeditions by sea came out of places like Veracruz and Florida, but due to shallow bays and unnavigable rivers, they were unable to locate La Salle's fort this way. Simultaneously, expeditions were taking place on land by a gentleman named Alonso de Leon. And what de Leon did, he was based in a little town called Cadrilleta, which is pretty close to Monclova down in Coahuila. And so he would, in his first expedition in 1686, he came to the Rio Grande River and he headed south to the mouth of the river. And then instead of turning north into Texas, on that first expedition, he headed south towards Veracruz. And so he was going the wrong way, and they didn't find La Salle's fort that way. A year later, in 1687, they did the same thing. They left Cadrilleta, they headed to the Rio Grande, and they got to the mouth of the river. This time they did turn north into Texas, and they got as far as what is probably Baffin Bay near Kingsville. And if any of y'all are familiar with Baffin Bay, you know it's a very large inlet. And so the Spanish saw this as impassable, and they felt like, you know, they were just kind of out there for no reason, that these were just rumors, that there weren't actually, that there weren't actually French out on the landscape. But yet these rumors persisted, so that in 1688, De Leon captured one of La Salle's men, a gentleman named Jean Giry, who was acting as a chief among some Native American tribes in the Anacacho Mountains just outside of Del Rio. So that by 1689, with Jean Giry in tow, De Leon was able to discover the ruins of Fort St. Louis. And it was in a complete shambles. There were books written in French with the pages torn out of them and just strewn about the landscape. And there were 3 French bodies, including a woman still in her dress, that the Spanish gave proper burial to. Even at that same time, the Spanish found the famed French cannons, which were discovered in the last 20, 25 years or so through archaeological efforts. And they buried those as well, just in case the French came back, they wouldn't be able to see them very easily. And of this 1689 expedition, famed Spanish colonial historian Carlos Castaneda states that it truly marks the beginnings of Texas, because this is the first time that these expeditions were penetrating as far as the Guadalupe River. Other Spanish expeditions or representatives, if you will, such as Cabeza de Vaca or Coronado, had come across Texas at various times, but those were more incidental or accidental, even in Cabeza de Vaca's case, where they were just coming across Texas unintentionally. This is the first time they're really starting to focus on Texas because of the French coming into the territory. And around that same time, according to Spanish record, Maria de Agreda, the lady in blue who you see pictured here, miraculously appeared to the Tejas Indians in East Texas and said to them that they should seek out the Spanish to learn about the Catholic faith. Therefore, a year later, in 1690, De Leon journeyed to the Neches River, where on June the 1st of that year, Mission San Francisco de los Tejas was established. So Spanish missionary aspirations and the beginnings of El Camino Real were being laid into the state. Over the next several years, the Camino Real really became a major route of travel. And in 1700, the Spanish founded the Mission and Presidio of San Juan Bautista on the Rio Grande, which is in a little town called Guerrero, just across the border and about 20 miles south of Eagle Pass. By 1714, the French founded Natchitoches on the eastern end of the trail. So once again, the Spanish saw this as a threat and a potential incursion into their territory. Therefore, by 1717, they established the first capital of Texas at Los Adais, which is in present-day Louisiana, out near a little town called Robeline. So I always like to say, if you can, bet your friends what the first capital of Texas is, and you can probably win by telling them that it's Los Adais. Most people are not aware of that. By 1718, the Villa of San Fernando de Bejar and Mission San Antonio de Valero, the Alamo, were founded. So as you can see, the road was really allowing this facilitation of trade and culture between Texas and Louisiana, And eventually it allowed Anglo settlers to head in from the east as they headed west into Texas. So that if we fast forward about 100 years, Moses Austin came down the Camino Real to San Antonio so that he could establish a Spanish colony. And as we know, his son Stephen F. Austin made good on that. And around the same time, many Anglo-American settlers began crossing into Texas on the Sabine at Gaines Ferry, and they came into places like Nacogdoches, San Antonio, and other places along the road. And in 1836, even famed Alamo combatant Davy Crockett came down the Camino Real to the Alamo, and it can be said that he would have continued down along the road to San Juan Bautista on the Rio Grande if he had not met his fate at that battle, because in his last known letter, he said that he was going to journey down there with the men to continue on with the fight. So as I said, that's a very brief history of the trail. If you're interested in learning more about the history of it, please visit our website, which is elcaminotrail.org, and click on our News and Events tab. And on that tab is a sublink that says Books and Reference Materials. And there are over 500 reference materials listed there where you can learn more about the history of the trail. Now we're going to transition into talking about the Camino Real in present times. Once again, we're going to talk about modern events leading up to the designation of the trail as a National Historic Trail, what it means to be a National Historic Trail and part of the National Trail System, and then finally how you can see and experience the trail today. So the modern history of the Camino Real begins in 1915, when the Texas legislature appropriated approximately $5,000 to V.N. Zivley to survey the route of the trail. Over the next couple of years, Zivley did survey the route of the trail from the Sabine to the Rio Grande, so that by 1918, markers such as this one that you see here were erected along one route of the trail. And as you can see, they say Kings Highway, Camino Real, Old San Antonio Road, marked by the Daughters of the American Revolution in the state of Texas, AD 1918. And these things are now historic in themselves. They're over 100 years old now. And there's about 125 of them that span from the Rio Grande to the Sabine. They're generally about 5 miles apart and generally on the north and west sides of roads, though they have been moved in various places because of roadway construction and that sort of things. Excuse me. There's a very interesting story of when some DAR ladies were GPSing locations of these markers in recent times, and they were down somewhere in South Texas trying to find where one of these was, and they kept driving around and looking for it, and they couldn't find anywhere it was, even though they knew they were in the right location. And they came to realize that it had been removed from the highway and was being used as a doorstep at someone's trailer home on the side of the road. And so they weren't happy about that, and they went and they got the local sheriff and were able to get that marker back out onto the road. So a little bit of ancillary Camino Real history there, but a little interesting twist in modern times. By 1929, the Texas legislature designated the Old San Antonio Road as one of the historic trails of Texas. And this was the first time in the history of the state that a roadway was designated as a historic highway of Texas. It wasn't until 2011 that the entirety of the Camino Real was designated as a historic highway of Texas. And that was only the second time in history that it happened. And that same 2011 legislation is also the legislation that allows us to place signs on modern roadways that mirror routes of the Camino Real, which you might have seen some of those in places like Goliad or San Antonio, Nacogdoches, and places such as that. By 1949, most of the road from the San Antonio to the Sabine had been paved. So the old Galicia Road that used to have ox carts and wagons rolling down it now had automobiles zooming into the future. And if we fast forward about 40 years or so, in 1991, the Texas legislature formed the Old San Antonio Road Preservation Commission. And that commission instructed TxDOT that it should survey the condition of the Camino Real. And that was done in order to commemorate the 300th anniversary of those entradas that De Leon was taking in the 1680s and 1690. So by 1991, TxDOT did put out this study that you see pictured here that determined that there were at least 5 additional routes of the trail used at various times. And so it really updated our, our understanding of the trail and gave us a fuller understanding of the various routes that the Spanish and others would have used in colonial times. This study also served as the basis for the National Park Service to conduct a feasibility study to determine whether or not the Camino Real met the criteria of being designated as a National Historic Trail. That feasibility study did in fact determine that the Camino met that criteria, so that on October 18th, 2004, El Camino Real was designated as a National Historic Trail and part of the National Trail System. And this begs the question, what is the National Trail System? The National Trail System was established by the National Trail System Act of 1968, and it was signed into law by a Texan, President LBJ. And today, that system is composed of 30 national scenic and national historic trails that span every state in the country. There are 11 national scenic trails, such as the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Crest Trail, or the Continental Divide Trail. And there are 19 national historic trails, such as our trail, the Trail of Tears, the Santa Fe Trail, or the Oregon Trail. Each one of these trails is somehow nationally significant to the American people, and it takes an act of the U.S. Congress to designate them as national scenic or historic trails. And in the case of the Camino Real de los Tejas, it's because it's the road that led to the founding of Texas, and we would not be calling Texas Texas without it today. I would also like to point out something on this map. If you notice, our trail is the only one that runs through the core of the state. The other Camino Real just barely skirts through El Paso before heading to Santa Fe. And because of that, Texas is a hotbed for National Historic Trail development right now. There are several feasibility studies going on for other National Historic Trails that could potentially be designated in the future. And those are trails such as the Chisholm and Great Western Cattle Trails, the Butterfield Overland Stage Route, and even Route 66 is being considered as a National Historic Trail. And that would, if that got designated, it would definitely be the first time that a modern roadway was designated as a National Historic Trail. So it would kind of shift the paradigm of what we think about National Historic Trails in some sense. And I'm actually very supportive of it. And it's something that will likely happen here in the not too distant future. So before long, I believe you will see this map changing. So what is a National Historic Trail? A National Historic Trail is an extended trail which must follow as closely as possible the original route of historic travel. And so this is how a historic trail differs from a scenic trail like the Appalachian. When they're building a trail like the Appalachian on the ground, they can go wherever they need to so that it's built. With a trail like the Camino Real, however, because it is based on a historic route of travel, we couldn't build a trail from, say, Austin to Dallas and call it the Camino Real, because historically it never went that way. So what does the Trail System Act say about the Camino Real? It says that in general, it's 2,580 miles of route extending from the Rio Grande near Eagle Pass and Laredo to Natchitoches, Louisiana. And here is a map of the Camino, so you can see it at a little bit of a closer view here. And as you can see, it's a very braided network of routes. And there are many reasons for that. For instance, if there was flooding coming off the Edwards Plateau between San Antonio and Austin, explorers would have went a different way to have avoided those flooded rivers and streams. Or if there were certain foodstuffs available on one part of the trail versus another, they would have gone that way to have taken advantage of those foodstuffs. Or if there were perceived Native American hostilities on one part of the trail versus another, they would have gone a different way to have avoided those hostilities. And I think, I don't know, hopefully you can see my cursor here. I believe you can. I'd like to point out that route that Zivley surveyed as well. And so, where did my cursor go? Here we go. He started right here at the Sabine. And basically, what we would think of nowadays as Highway 21 came through San Augustine and Alto, all the way down through Crockett till right here at this point where it breaks off of 21 is the old San Antonio Road up and around Bryan College Station to where it comes back into 21 right about this point and goes down through Bastrop as 21 all the way into San Marcos. There are smaller roads there that also are close to 21, much as we see here in the Central Texas corridor between San Marcos and San Antonio, where there are smaller roads paralleling I-35 that overlay the historic route of the Camino Real. And then once it gets to San Antonio, that Zibli route comes down this way, south through Atascosa County and over towards Guerrero, where San Juan Bautista is right here, just south of Eagle Pass. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can see and experience the trail today. Starting at the Rio Grande, the Jesus Trevino Fort and Rancho is in San Ignacio, Texas. And it's a casa fuerte, or a strong house, that's there on the banks of the Rio Grande. San Ignacio is definitely one of my favorite spots along the trail. The Park Service talks about getting a vicarious experience of traveling these historic routes when you're going out to see and experience parts of the trail. And for me, San Ignacio is just so evocative because it is like being in an old Mexican town on the border there. The architecture is just so beautiful. It's a small little town, probably if there's, 1,500 people, I'd be surprised. And this building started off as a single room home that was eventually expanded to create a walled compound so that Jesus Trevino and his family there could seek shelter in the fort from Native American raids and that sort of thing. It's an amazing place that is owned by the River Pierce Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization there in San Ignacio. And they do have it open for tours on Sundays once a month by appointment. I'm not exactly sure if they're still doing that during the pandemic. So I would check River Pierce's website if you are interested in going out and visiting this site. It would be an amazing trip if you were able to do so, and I highly recommend it if you can. Heading east on the trail towards San Antonio, the San Antonio Missions and the Alamo are part of the trail. So most of you have probably been to the Alamo and probably the Missions as well, and you may not have realized you were at a Camino Real site. So we're working to kind of change that if we can in some ways, and we're doing different things like getting site identification signs at the Missions and hopefully at the Alamo once the redevelopment there is done in the coming years, so that people will, when they arrive at these spots, see that they're at a Camino Real site and make that connection that they're on the trail. Other sites within San Antonio that are trail resources are places like San Fernando Cathedral and the Spanish Governor's Palace. There's also the Medina River Greenway in southern Bexar County, which has the second longest hiking trail on the Camino Real, and that's there at a place called the Paso de Dolores, the Pass of Sorrows, which goes over to a place called the Perez Jacal, which is a beautiful example of an old Indian, early Spanish and Mexican colloquial architectural structure there in the Greenway. It's a really amazing place. So I would recommend trying to see that if you can as well. Heading down a little closer to the Rockport area, in Goliad, Texas, is Mission Espiritu Santo and Presidio La Bahia. And this is the last site of the Mission and the Presidio. Originally, there were 3 additional sites that were in Victoria County. When the Spanish first discovered La Salle's Fort, as an example, they placed the first iteration of Presidio La Bahia right on top of La Salle's Fort there in Victoria County on Garcitas Creek. But here in Goliad today, these locations were established about 1749. And the Presidio, I will say, is probably the best example of a Spanish Presidio anywhere in the Southwest. It's an amazing place. And as a little side note, they even rent out a room there as a hotel overnight. It's supposed to be one of the most haunted hotels in Texas. And I've never been able to do it, but if you can, it does sound like an amazing experience that I've had a lot of people tell me it is like nothing else they've ever done. So Presidio La Bahia there in Goliad and Mission Espiritu Santo, a couple of ways to see and experience the trail. As we head further east along the trail into East Texas, places like Mission Tejas and the Old Stone Fort in Nacogdoches are other sites along the trail. Mission Tejas is run by Texas Parks and Wildlife, and as you can see in this picture, they have a commemorative structure there to commemorate that first mission established in 1690, and that's Mission San Francisco de los Tejas. There's also a swale or a remnant of the actual road of the Camino Real there in the park. So it's one of those rare places anywhere along the trail that you can actually hike down the Camino Real and truly get that vicarious experience of traveling in the footsteps of explorers from hundreds of years ago. The old stone fort, or the Casa de Piedra in Nacogdoches, is now a museum replica on the Stephen F. Austin State University campus, and it hosts different kinds of exhibits on the trail history and early Nacogdoches history. And it also has a demonstration garden in the front of it, just to illustrate the kinds of plants that Native Americans, Spanish, French, and others would have used in early times. Originally, the old stone fort was Gil Ibarbo's trading post, and it was on the main plaza in Nacogdoches, right on the road. A little interesting side note about Ibarbo is he had a large tract of land out there in East Texas that he had a giant ranch on, and it was known as the Lobanil Rancho. And our association a few years back was actually able to purchase a place known as the Lobanil Swales, which is part of Ibarbo's rancho. So it's a really neat thing. We can actually trace our deed all the way back to the 1790s Spanish land grant that gave that property over to Gil Ibarbo. So there's a nice connection between our property, the Lobanillo Swales, which is about 10 miles east of San Augustine and maybe 20 miles west of the Louisiana border off of Highway 21. It's open to the public and free of charge, and it's been fully developed and was dedicated to the public in 2018. So if you can get out that way, I would highly encourage you to go and see it as well. Other places to see the trail are river crossings and trail segments. So with rivers and streams, if we can think about them, generally they have very steep banks and narrow channels. So the trail really had to funnel down to certain places to make these river crossings, places where the banks widened out and flattened out so that the Spanish and others could cross these rivers very easily. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see Apache Pass in Milam County, which is a historic crossing of the San Gabriel River there in the area. This is also the location of the San Javier Mission Complex, and not too far away, the Rancheria Grande. The San Javier Mission Complex was composed of 3 Spanish missions that were there in the area from the late 1740s to the early 1750s. And the Rancheria Grande was a huge Native American community that had 23 Native American bands or tribes in the area that would come there to trade at various times a year, to intermarry and make relations, so that it was essentially a huge trading post there and a site where they came together for ceremonies and other things of that nature. It's a place that we've done some archaeological research in recently, and we've actually discovered 3 Native American village sites within the Rancheria, multiple swales within sandy soil, which was the first time swales or old remnants of the road were actually discovered in sandy soils. No one ever thought that the Spanish would take ox carts and wagons through sandy soils. And there are also more Native American artifacts in the Rancheria Grande than you can possibly imagine. And that was a really great effort that 3 private landowners gave their own money for, to help to do this kind of research, because they knew that the history there was important and they wanted to share it with the public. And one of those sites is the Connor Swale site, and they do have visits out there periodically in non-pandemic times. And so if you can visit our website in the future and look at our news and events link, we will have those notices when the Connor Swale site is available for visit there in the Rancheria. To the right of the photo, you see McKinney Falls State Park, and you can see a large limestone slab there. And there's a couple of worn impressions in the center of that photo heading towards the tree line. That is the crossing of Onion Creek here in the Austin area. And when I first moved here, 25 years ago now, I used to go down to the park to swim sometimes at the Lower Falls crossing here. And I always wondered, wow, I can't believe that, this path was worn here just from people come to swim here at this swimming hole. But at the time, I had no idea about the Camino Real. And after going to school and doing what I've been doing here for the last several years, I came to realize, wow, this is actually the old historic crossing of the road, or the stream, I should say. And so we're doing a lot of work with Texas Parks, McKinney Falls there, to document swales and other things like rock walls in the park. And we're learning a lot about various routes in that area. And we're continuing to do some of that mapping later this year once it starts cooling off a little bit. So stay tuned for that. There might be some opportunities for people to come out and volunteer and walk around and do some GPSing of those swale remnants and stuff like that out there in the park. Down in the center of the image, you can see Mission Tejas State Park. And as I mentioned a little earlier, it's one of the rare places where you can actually walk in a swale in the footpath of the actual trail. And you can see that little Texas Park sign there that says El Camino Real in yellow and brown. And hopefully you can see in this image, I'll try to get my cursor here, there's this U-shaped depression right here running on this path through the trees. That's what the swale is, this U-shaped depression. It's a lot like a wagon rut. If we look back over here towards Apache Pass, these are some modern ruts, if you will, made by the landowner Kit Worley, and that's what we think of as ruts. These kind of wheel marks that are created like that. A swale is this U-shaped depression like this that you see in the landscape, and so it's a little bit different, but created by the same kind of activity, movement by wagons, ox carts, cattle, and that sort of thing along the landscape. So as I begin to wind down here, I'd like to encourage you to visit our website, which is elcaminotrail.org, and learn more about us. We are a nonprofit 501c3 organization, and we're only able to do what we do with the support of people like you. We try to be as transparent as possible so that you will feel comfortable in supporting us in our efforts. So we do things like put our meeting minutes onto our website, our financial records, our strategic plan, and more. So please visit our website, learn more about us, and if you feel comfortable in doing so, please join and become a member today or make a donation. And with that said, here is my contact information, and I will be happy to take any questions at this point. Hopefully I can find my way back to where I need to be to see those questions, or at least turn my screen back on. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Stephen. We really appreciate the really great presentation that you gave us. For those of you that are online, if you have any questions for Stephen, please use the chat box, and I will read those questions to him. And while we're waiting for that, Stephen, again, that was really a great presentation. Really a lot of good information that you gave us, and I really like how you incorporated all those different places that people can go and actually see, the El Camino Real and learn more about it and actually experience it in person. And since I work for state parks, I have to give a quick plug. At Goliad State Park, they have a relatively new visitor center. It's called the El Camino Real Visitor Center, and they also have a lot of information as well. So, okay, and so we have a question from Julie Vickers. How important was the Victoria area on the El Camino Real?
Well, hey, Julie, it's been a long time. Julie's done some volunteer work out at our property, Lobanillo, years ago. We did an archaeological dig out there with Julie. So it's good to see you, Julie. And I hope that you and your family are doing well during this crazy pandemic year we're having. The Victoria area is extremely important to the trail and early Texas history. Like I said at the beginning of my presentation, in my opinion, that is where true Texas history really begins, because it is when the Spanish began to truly focus on Texas because of the French arriving there at La Salle's Fort. And, as I said a little earlier, there are 3 Spanish mission sites and presidio sites that were there in the Victoria area. First, there was out near La Salle's Fort on Garcitas Creek. And then they moved over to Tonkawa Bank, more in the heart of the city. And then they moved over towards the Guadalupe River in a place known as Mission Valley. And that was the 3rd site of the mission. And that is on the Clegg property. The Cleggs are private landowners who do periodically allow visitors out to that site to see and experience it. And if you can, that is a very amazing property to see. They actually have remnants of that third mission site there in an unimproved form. So, like the missions in San Antonio or Goliad, as examples, those were reconstructed at various times to build them back up into what their former glory was. But there at the Clegg property, you can just see, some remnants of the walls and the floors and things like that. So the Clegg property is an amazing place. So we do have official National Park Service signage in Victoria County that highlights where these trail sites are, both the sites such as Tonkwell Bank and the Clegg property. And then there are some roadway signs that direct people to these various sites in the area. We're hopeful that we're going to have some sort of an effort there in the not too distant future where we can talk about that greater history of all the missions between Victoria and Goliad and how they came to be there in the Goliad area eventually in 1749. The pandemic has slowed us down this year because of our inability to really have in-person meetings and get things going of that nature. But look for that in the future. We do plan on having something big in Victoria. Hopefully, I'm hoping next year we'll be able to make that happen.
Okay, and from Alan, he says, outstanding presentation. He really enjoyed it and asks, are you all not part of the Texas Park system and receive its financial support?
Well, hello, Alan. Thank you for the compliment on the presentation. We are not part of the Texas Park system. The Camino Real itself is a National Historic Trail that is administered by the National Park Service. And we, the Camino Real Trail Association, are a nonprofit 501c3 organization that works with the Park Service in partnership to identify, protect, and develop the trail. But the trail it's not your traditional kind of trail where you get on point A and you hike to point Z, as an example. It is composed of sites and segments. And so if you think back to my presentation a minute ago, I was pointing out places like the Trevino Fort on the Rio Grande, the Alamo, and the Old Stone Fort in Nacogdoches. Those would be considered sites or points on the trail. And then there are segments which are either elongated driving routes, such as I mentioned, Highway 21 is a major component of the trail, and so that would be considered a driving segment of the trail. And then there are hikeable portions of the trail, such as our property at the Lobanillo Swales, the Medina River Greenway, which I mentioned a little earlier. And the longest hiking segment of the trail is in Floresville at the Hike and Bike Trail there. It's about 3.5 miles of signed hiking trail in the middle of the city that mirrors the La Bahia Road portion of the Camino Real, which historically ran from San Antonio to Goliad and at one point Victoria when the missions were there a little earlier. So there are some Texas Park sites. Goliad State Park, Mission Tejas State Park, and McKinney Falls State Park are the main ones. We're also, I'm forgetting, there's a fort out near Centerville that needs some research done, and it is a state park there in the area. Fort Boggy, that needs a little bit more research to determine whether or not that is conclusively linked to the trail. But there are multiple state park sites that do have trail segments within them. So the point being that the trail is administered by several different entities. Texas Parks and Wildlife, the Texas Historic Commission has some sites such as Cattle Mound State Historic Site or Casa Navarro. There are city parks that are part of the trail, county parks, and then nonprofits such as us. We own a part of it. The River Pierce Foundation owns a little site down in Zapata County. So it's cared for by many different entities and jurisdictions.
Okay, from Melanie, is the Old Spanish Trail OST in Houston related to this?
That's a good question, Melanie. And no, it's not. The Old Spanish Trail was an early 1900s driving route from Florida to California that was built much like Route 66 in the early 1900s to encourage driving and tourism along that route. It's often confused with the Camino Real de los Tejas. And just the term Old Spanish Trail or El Camino Real is a very kind of general term, if you will. There is an Old Spanish National Historic Trail that does run from Santa Fe to Los Angeles, and that is administered by the same National Trails Office from the Park Service that we work with. And I do know that the OST that you're referring to is nearing its 100th anniversary. I'm not sure if it's 2021 or 2025 when that happens, but there's a big group in San Antonio that's working to have a commemoration of that 100th anniversary of the OST. But no, it's not associated with the Camino Real de los Tejas.
Okay, from Ella, how did Native Americans interact with the trails?
That's a good question, Ella. Thank you for that. You know, it depended from place to place and from time to time. When the Spanish first came to this area in or I should say places like San Antonio, they brought with them Native Americans from central Mexico. The Tlaxcalans were a Native American tribe that the Spanish encountered very early on, before they had even conquered the Aztecs there at Mexico City at Tenochtitlan. And so there was an alliance there that had already been in place for several hundred years, and the Tlaxcalans came all the way with the Spanish to San Antonio on their initial expeditions into the Texas area. And then at other times, it varied. In the Rancheria Grande, as an example, our archaeology and our research there determined that the Spanish actually had to make alliances with the Tejas Alliance, which was those 23 bands or tribes. They were essentially Coahuiltecan-speaking people, various smaller tribes and bands, such as the Irvi-Apiyame. I can never say that one right. And they had to make alliances in order to be able to pass through that area safely. And there was a man, a Native American man named El Cuyon, who was actually a governor who was appointed as the Native American governor by the Spanish in San Antonio. And so there were good relations there, so that the Spanish could, be in that area and pass through that area. But then at other times, as we know, such as at the Presidio at San Saba, which is not officially part of the trail, but which is historically linked to all of the missions and presidios in Texas. There were Native American attacks there that destroyed that fort and forced the Spanish to flee that area. So it just really varied from time to time and place to place. People think of the Caddo as some of those early interactions with the Spanish as well, and that's very true. And that's where the word Tejas comes from. It's that old Hassanai word, which is a Caddoan band, which the Spanish took to mean as friend. And so the Caddo were always more friendly with the Spanish. And they were more on the eastern end of the trail at places like Los Adais and that sort of area. But for instance, when the first capital of Texas was removed from Los Adais to San Antonio, there were several hundred Adai Caddo Indians that came with the Spanish to San Antonio upon that removal of the capital from Los Adais to San Antonio. So the relations could just vary from place to place and time to time, but it was a very interesting history. And if you're interested in learning more about it, particularly the Rancheria Grande, we do have books for sale on our website. If you go to elcaminotrail.org and underneath the Support Us link, there's a place there to buy that research study that we did a couple of years ago.
Okay, that looks like it is it for the questions. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add, Stephen?
No, just thank you all for your time and interest. It was great to be here with you today. This is my first ever Zoom presentation. I've done 1,000 Zoom meetings this year, but never a presentation. So thank you for having me, and I hope it went as smoothly on y'all's end.
Yeah, it went great. And Julie says excellent presentation. Yeah, it went great, Stephen. So thank you again, and thank you all for joining, and that'll conclude the presentation. So one second, Pam wanted something to add.
Just more coming up in 2 weeks.
I'm sorry.
In 2 weeks, we'll have one.
Pam wanted to add that we will be having another presentation in 2 weeks. So please join us. And okay, well, thank you all, and take care.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.